Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Sophia, your host. Canada's end-of-life debate is heating up. The federal Liberals have passed a resolution at their policy convention calling for the decriminalization of medically assisted suicide. The Quebec government has proposed legislation to the same effect. And the Supreme Court has also decided to revisit a 1993 decision against physician-assisted suicide. Why are the old rules against euthanasia and assisted suicide being challenged? And what does religion have to say about end of life? Do we have a right to die and to be free of suffering? What kinds of treatments and interventions are necessary for those who are terminally ill? We speak with Dr. Shabir Ally, President of the Islamic Information Center, about the end of life debate. Dr. Shabir Ally, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
Now, modern medicine enables us to live longer, but it doesn't actually relieve us of any suffering, or it relieves us to some extent, but not of the major suffering that some people, for example, with cancer or some other degenerative diseases face. So this raises questions about end of life and whether people have the right to, at a certain point, say, I want to end my life. I've lived a long life, and I'm happy leaving now, and not suffering anymore. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right in that medical science can give us longer life, but not necessarily relieve to our satisfaction the sufferings that we experience. And in that case, in a way, medical science now is the cause of this prolonged suffering, because what would have happened without the kinds of heroic interventions that we have at our access nowadays is that in the past people would have just
died.
Yes, and that's unfortunate, but at the same time it did not prolong the sufferings of the individuals. So it is interesting that Islam strikes a reasonable balance in most things in life, especially with end-of-life decisions, and that according to what is generally understood as Islamic principles, it is not necessary for one to take medication if one does not feel that there's any benefit to this. Mm-hmm. So it in the end becomes a personal decision whether to take further medication and to prolong life. So let's say somebody is actually suffering terribly and one realizes, well, time has come for me to go and meet my Lord. Then for a Muslim it's an easier decision, because to begin with there is not this great fear of death. One has the expectation of meeting God, and there is some hope that by dying one would go into a better situation than the situation one is experiencing here in life.
Mm-hmm. I was actually doing some research on this topic, and I realized that many other religious traditions have the same idea, that you can refuse certain treatments if you feel that it wouldn't add significant benefit to your life. If it won't really do much for you, then you can refuse it.
Yes, and an interesting concept came out of, was stated in the recent Maclean's article on this question, in which it was suggested also that there is the possibility of giving a treatment to a person in pain that will basically sedate the person. And this sedation actually, or this sort of treatment to relieve pain, could shorten the person's life. Mm-hmm. But the shortening of the person's life is not the intention behind giving this medication. It's just a kind of side effect, or a thing here has a two-pronged sort of effect, and you intend the one, not the other. It is interesting that it's put in this way, because in the Islamic ethos it is accepted that actions are by intention. It is even stated in the hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are according to the intentions, or judged by intentions. So when one takes such a pain relief medication, knowing that one of its effects would be the shortening of life, well, one is not taking it for shortening life, but for the relief of pain, and this is a legitimate reason, and that is a good intention. It just so happens, unfortunately, that this will also shorten life. But to me, there's no harm in doing that. It's all within the acceptable limits.
Mm-hmm. Do you think individuals have a right to die?
This is an interesting question. Certainly we have a right to life, and everything has proceeded so far in society with this understanding that people have a right to life, and we must do everything we can not only to protect our own lives but also to protect the lives of others. And we must of course do everything to avert any danger to person and property, to our own and to others.
It's even an Islamic principle, the preservation of life.
Yes, exactly. And the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors have been taking for 2,400 years, mandates for them that they must do everything to preserve the lives of their patients. And now suddenly in the modern discussions, the possibility of killing a person with medical aid is now raised as a real possibility. And in the past, for someone to kill a person, it would have been by some drastic and brutal method, and now the simple injection of a fatal fluid would do the trick. And so everything looks so simple now, and the question is, why don't we do that? And the flip side of that is that patients are saying, we have a right to die with dignity. We have a right to die. And one might say, well, okay, you have a right to die. We're not denying you that right. Go ahead. You want to die. This is your business. But then the patient says, but no, I want society to come in and provide somebody who will give me that fatal last shot.
Especially if they're not capable of doing that themselves.
Yes, and of course capability is not only physical but emotional. One may not be up to the idea of taking one's own life, but one may be more comfortable with the thought that the physician is administering that fatal dose, and I'll just be sedated and allow for this to take its effect, and I'm gone.
Could be that the doctor gives you a prescription, you know, and that you just use the prescription.
A kind of do it yourself,
Yes.
in which case you might do it yourself or have somebody else administer it for you. So euthanasia is when the doctor does it for you, and medically assisted suicide is when he gives you a prescription or she gives you a prescription and then you do it yourself or get somebody else to do it for you. In each case, the underlying premise is that we have the right to die and to die with dignity, and we can make that our choice. Well, then that is the original question. Do people really have this right to die? Well, if we take God out of the picture, people may say, well, why shouldn't we have that right? And the difficulty there is that if you open up that door, then there's no closing it, because if I have the right to die because I'm in this great pain, what if I'm a teenager and I don't have physical pain, but I have emotional pain, which for some teenagers can be worse than physical pain.
Yes, we've recently seen with bullying and those sorts of things that some teenagers have actually taken their own lives.
Yes, and it doesn't have to be teenagers, it could be anyone. Somebody suffering from a broken marriage, a ruined love relationship, somebody has lost a lot of money through investment or from gambling. Many different circumstances in life could make a person feel so down that the only exit for them from this great emotional burden is to end their lives. So do they have the right to end their lives? And not so much to speak of their right, is this good for society that we as a society promote the idea that if somebody is suffering to a great extent, then it is really their choice to end their lives. Then another fallout from this would be that if you have elderly people who are being cared for by their relatives, you can have greedy relatives who want to inherit from these elderly persons and encourage them to end their lives. You may have families who are feeling overburdened by the care that is required for the elderly parents or other relatives, and they want to find a quick and easy exit from this burden of caring for the elderly, and so they encourage the elderly to take their own lives, or they start doing it for them. What about the persons who cannot make these decisions for themselves? And they could be young or old, but they do not have that mental capacity.
Even for people who, for example, are disabled, right? They might feel pressure to consider ending their lives rather than being a burden on other people.
Yeah,
or
so
on the
these are
healthcare
all
system,
yes, and these are all of the problems that are involved with opening that door. Now, in logic, we know that there is the slippery slope argument, which is a fallacy in argumentation. It's a fallacy to say that you take the first step, you fall all the way to the bottom, because you can take the first step and actually stay there. You don't have to go further. And so one can say, well, there could be legislation put into place, and bodies can be created, panels, to review cases and only approve the cases which are the most terrible. But over time, what will happen is that once you start going down that road, the terrible case will change its definition. So what was once not so terrible a case will now loom as one of the most terrible cases, and that needs to be dealt with as well. In other words, the bar will shift, and we will start accepting more and more the claim of people that life is too unbearable, we can't live this anymore, we have a right to die, you must take our lives.
One of the interesting things that I noticed when I was doing research is that Islam has a very unique take on suffering. Muslims don't necessarily see suffering as a very bad thing, but they see suffering as a means to purify themselves.
Yes, previously I said that if we take God out of the picture, this is how things look. Okay, let's bring God back in the picture and see how things look. With belief in God, the believer, whether Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or Christian or Jew, with a belief in God, I know many Buddhists have a non-theistic approach, but some have a theistic approach as well. With the belief in God, the sense of our own worth is greatly increased. You see, without God, you're thinking, I'm suffering, what's the purpose of this life? It looks like this life is a terrible thing, and this mindless universe coughed me up, and eventually will swallow me up again, and what's the point of bearing the suffering in the meantime? Why don't I go now?
There might not even be a concept of life after death in that conception of things.
True, but with belief in God, there is a sense that God created me for a purpose, and even my suffering has a purpose. I don't understand it fully, but I know that in the end of all things, God's justice will prevail, and it might look unfair now that I'm suffering and other people are enjoying themselves, but in the Islamic ethos, we are taught that God saves up a reward for the people who are suffering in this life. So we will be compensated for that suffering in the life hereafter, to the extent that when people see that reward, they will be happy that they had this suffering because of the reward. Of course, that doesn't mean that while we're suffering now, we should say, let's be happy and suffer. But it is some consolation. This is why it is mentioned that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, visited the sick, he said to them, La ba'as, tahurun insha'Allah. Don't worry about it. It'll be a purification if God wills. And that purification has this sense that we commit sins, and as a result of our sins, we might have suffered in the life hereafter, but by suffering in sickness here, we are actually alleviating the suffering that we would have suffered in the life hereafter, and that is the worst suffering. So even suffering can have a purpose and a healing effect and an ultimate benefit. So when the believer is suffering, it's not the end of all things. The believer knows, I'm going through a test, and if I exercise patience, like the patience of Job, or even a fraction of that, of the Prophet Ayub, then we will sit right with God in the end.
We talked about suffering, about science to begin with, and I guess there's an impetus now for science to come forward and try to alleviate the suffering, try to find ways to alleviate the suffering of those who are terminally ill.
Yes, and this is where palliative care comes in, and that is an important part of religious thinking. In religious thinking, we want to care for other people who are ill especially, and we believe that there is a reward with God for that. So religious people should be volunteering to help with the care of the elderly and the ill and the dying.
All right, thank you for that, Dr. Shabir Ally.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return, we will look at a social media initiative called Feed the Deed.